Famous Pianists and Their Technique, Chapter 9, The Lyricism of Chopin. Summary by Laura Aguirre. This chapter begins with Chopin's arrival in Paris in 1831. He was about 21 years old at the time, and he got the chance here to meet Frederick Kalkbrenner, who was a super famous pianist, teacher, and composer. This gentleman gave Chopin access to the inner musical circle there in Paris, and upon their first meeting, Chopin plays his E minor concerto for Kalkbrenner, and Kalkbrenner is extremely impressed with Chopin's abilities, and he of course plays some music for him in return, and Chopin's super impressed with his ability to, even when he messed up, apparently he was reading through the music and he lost his place. Kalkbrenner was able to get right back on track. Chopin was very impressed with that. And so they decided to do some daily meetings, and soon after, Kalkbrenner proposes that Chopin become his student for the next 3 years. So what were Kalkbrenner's intentions? Well, according to Joseph Elsner, who was Chopin's teacher from the conservatory there in Warsaw, in Poland, he didn't trust Kalkbrenner. He thought he was jealous. And he states here that, and this is a quote here from page 144, that they've recognized genius in Frederick and are already scared that he will outstrip them, so that they want to keep their hands on him for 3 years in order to hold back something of that which nature herself might push forward. So he thought they were doing it on purpose, or Kalkbrenner was like, all right, I'll keep Chopin as a student, we'll let him do certain things, that way the other pianists, in particular maybe Kalkbrenner himself, can still be number one, so to speak. And Elsner also kind of pointed out another instance. Apparently Kalkbrenner had crossed out some music in one of Chopin's pieces, his E minor concerto, and it was an unfair assumption that, oh, this is bad, get this out of the piece, without Kalkbrenner really analyzing the music, and Elsner didn't like that too much. So it wasn't just Elsner. Chopin's father and his sister also were kind of baffled as to why there would be such a long period to be his student. That being said, Chopin does defend Kalkbrenner, and he says that, I am firmly convinced that I shall not be an imitation of Kalkbrenner. He has not the power to extinguish my perhaps too audacious but noble wish and intention to create for myself a new world. He says that even Kalkbrenner was thinking, okay, maybe 3 years is too much, but we'll proceed here and see what happens. So a little bit about Chopin's beginnings. He was a Polish pianist and composer. Did not live a very long life. His first teacher was Adalbert Rzewny, and his second teacher, Joseph Elsner, director of the Warsaw Conservatory, as mentioned before in the previous slide. I get the feeling that Elsner genuinely really saw a major talent in Chopin and wanted him to flourish and to become quite successful. The next couple of pages in the chapter has several descriptions of Chopin's performance abilities and his compositions, kind of in different gazettes and magazines. I'm going to read a couple of them because they are just so good. Here, one article says that his playing, like his compositions, of which we heard on this occasion only variations, has a certain character of modesty which seems to indicate that to shine is not the aim of this young man, although his execution conquered difficulties, the overcoming of which even here, in the home of pianoforte virtuosos, could not fail to cause astonishment. His touch, although neat and sure, has little of that brilliance by which our virtuoso announce themselves as such in the first bars. It continues here. He plays very quietly, without the daring élan which generally at once distinguishes the artist from the amateur. Next, here it describes that about his touch, the delicacy of touch, indescribable finger dexterity, and the deep feeling shown by his command of shading is something that a lot of people noticed. Also, it says here, although his style of playing and writing differs greatly from that of other virtuosos, and indeed chiefly in this, that the desire to make good music predominates noticeably in his case over the desire to please. The chapter continues saying that Chopin's intensely musical nature, his incredible control of infinite number of subtle dynamic shading and rhythmic nuances, always had a stronger appeal for the musically discerning than for the populace. And then it ends here saying that he surpassed even Hummel in his tendencies of feeling and refinement of taste. So for us that know already a little bit about Chopin, These descriptions here are evident that he wasn't necessarily the showy, bombastic pianist as, Liszt, for example, I think has more of that reputation. But yet he had something very special that a lot of people were noticing. Chopin is in Vienna for about a year or so. He's there November of 1830, and during this time he encounters a rival. Sigismund Thalberg, who was also a virtuoso pianist and composer of this time, was very famous, very popular. His style of performing was one that would please the audience. He was more of a showy pianist, more bombastic playing compared to Chopin. And it was during this time that Chopin did not feel very fulfilled living in Vienna. Not so much because of this rival, but I think maybe in general. There was a lot of political issues going on, and the revolution kept him from going back to Poland, which he really, really was homesick. And so he decided to leave Vienna, and instead he went to Paris, and he wanted to start a new life there. He spent about 18 years in Paris. He formed a lot of new friendships, Mendelssohn and Liszt included. But while he was there, he did not perform very much in public, though the public did like him a lot. They actually deemed him as one of the top pianists of this time. Chopin then confesses to Liszt about his stage fright, and he says here, "I am not fitted to give concerts. The public frightens me. I feel suffocated by its panting breath, paralyzed by its curious glance, mute before those unknown faces. But you are destined for it, for when you do not win the public, you are able to overwhelm it." So it's evident here we have these two extraordinary pianists, but one is extremely introvert and shy, and the other is being Liszt, is definitely much more comfortable in the public eye. During his time in Paris, Chopin becomes friends with a family called the Wódzinka family, and he falls in love with a daughter named Maria. Several months after this meeting and him having a girlfriend, he wants to visit his family. He's missing his family quite a bit, and so he decides to meet his family in Carlsbad, Germany. I'm horrible with my European geography here, and I kind of screenshot here more or less the travels that he's taking at this point. So Carlsbad is between Paris and Dresden. So Dresden is where the red icon is right there on the picture. And that's where he meets his family. They have a wonderful reunion. And then from there, he travels to Dresden, which is where the red icon is there. And he meets up there with Mendelssohn and Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann, Clara Weck at the time. She's still not married to Schumann. And he also meets Clara's father, Frederick Weck, who is also a music teacher. And Clara's father is a little skeptical about Chopin's abilities, and of course they invite him over. He plays there at the house, and once again everyone's like amazed. Chopin is a marvelous pianist. Chopin in turn asks Clara to perform for him some of his etudes, and he's also impressed. So it's basically a house of musicians impressed with each other's abilities. And Mendelssohn as well, who is more on the classical side of composing and performing. He also is impressed with Chopin, and he writes to his sister Fanny saying that there's something thoroughly original in his pianoforte playing, and at the same time so masterly that he may be called the most perfect virtuoso. So Mendelssohn also is warming up to this new kind of romantic style of playing. Well, it's kind of leaning less towards the classical style. And Chopin's making more of a name for himself here. He then returns to Paris around 1835, where he discovers that Thalberg and Liszt are now in a type of rivalry competition. Chopin doesn't want to get involved, but he helps his friend out in a performance. They have a recital, kind of maybe it was a little recital battle here between Liszt and Thalberg, and Chopin performs with Liszt, Liszt's Grande Valse on stage, and apparently it's a big hit. They make a big impression on the audience, but unfortunately at this time also Chopin is starting to get sick, so there's early signs of his tuberculosis. And to top that off, Maria is kind of not feeling it anymore, and she no longer wants to be with Chopin, or it's not clear if maybe her family isn't too fond of him anymore, and things kind of died down there, and of course now Chopin is alone. Chopin had always hoped that Maria would eventually contact him, but she never did. During this time, Liszt actually introduced him to another woman named Aurora Dudevant, also known as George Sand. She was a writer, and she used the name George Sand as a pseudonym to get some of her works published. Initially, when Chopin met her, he probably wasn't that attracted to her, as she was kind of a masculine woman and she would wear trousers, but for whatever reason he was drawn to her and they eventually started a relationship that lasted about 10 years. I'm thinking part of the demise of the relationship was because he was so ill that I think George Sand took care of him quite a bit. So they broke up before his death, about 2 years before he died. And the last 2 years of Chopin's life, he did do some performances. His last major performance in Paris was in 1848. And then he did some travels throughout England and Scotland where he did some more smaller, intimate performances. And people did observe him being sick, but they still found his music to be beautiful and brilliant. Even though he was ill, I can imagine how hard this might have been for him. I actually feel bad for Chopin, but even Liszt saying he still was playing beautifully. He did die, of course, in 1849 in Paris, and he was there with his friends and his sister. What can be said about Chopin's technique and teaching? He left such a large impact on the music world, in particular the piano world. So Chopin's music itself, it emphasizes the importance of singing piano technique, a lot of legato playing and rubato, which was something becoming quite popular during this time, and the use of hand extensions. He wrote a lot of music with intervals of a tenth or larger, changes in fingering, the use of the thumb on the black keys, which at the time was still a no-no, that you shouldn't be using the thumb on the black keys, but Chopin did not care, and quite frankly, there was no other way around it. In some of his pieces, you had to use the thumb on the black keys. And apparently he had exquisite technique with the pedal, using the pedal to emphasize his music and keeping it clean and beautiful, not muddied down or anything like that. Chopin as a teacher, he was not as impactful as Liszt, probably simply because he died so young. Liszt, of course, lived much longer and was able to build a bigger, quote unquote, piano studio in his later years, whereas Chopin, being sick, of course, did not allow him to do this. But he was recorded as being a very good teacher. Some of the goals for his students were for them to play with suppleness of touch. He was very aware of them not being stiff or playing cramped, as that would not allow for this beautiful romantic style of playing. He talked a lot about full tone, the inward and outward movement of the wrists, and he never wanted his students to get fatigued fingers. So I think one student commented that they practiced 6 hours one day, and he was like, no, don't do that. 3 hours, you don't want to get tired, and that'll interrupt your practice with trying to play with this full tone touch. So an example of something they'd have them do would be practice scales, playing as connectedly as possible, and of course upping the metronome mark as they did so. So what can be said about this great pianist and composer? Well, Mendelssohn said himself that Chopin was a perfect virtuoso. His physical coordination was at the highest quality that he had ever seen. Liszt would describe him to his students, and he would tell his students to play with a Chopinesque rubato, saying that that type of rubato is as if you're seeing the wind blow in the trees and move the leaves, that they should emulate that at the piano. Other people observed his variety of touch and extreme delicacy at the piano. Chopin's purpose was not to shine. I don't think he really set out to be this big superstar. He was known for being quite shy and having this very sensitive nature about him. And I think Chopin simply wanted to create beautiful music during his lifetime.